CHÉOS exists to improve health outcomes for BC, Canada, and the world. Learn more at chaos.ubc.ca.
It's my pleasure to introduce Jasmine Grant. She's going to talk to us about the necessity of good documentation practices and the value of learning from quality reviews. She is the lead at the research training program at the Cancer Clinical Research Unit at Princess Margaret Cancer Centre in Toronto. Also a professor at Seneca College in Toronto. And most importantly, at least from my perspective, she is the co-lead, along with me, of the N2 Education Committee. And N2 are the group, the network of networks that provides us with a lot of the GCP and the Division 5 training that we do for our studies. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me, everyone. So I've just included a few pieces on this slide, including my email address, if anyone would like to get hold of me, as well as a link to the city program. Leslie and I work very hard to update this training content, and we're getting to be pretty proud of it, I would say. So be sure to find more training content, both in the city program and also, if you'd like, you can be added to our distribution list for the Princess Margaret Cancer Centre, which offers webinars like this several times a month. So if you're interested, connect, and we can talk more about clinical research. So let's get started today. What we're going to do is review source data, source documents, and good documentation management. We're also going to talk about CRFs, case report forms, electronic data capture, and good data management. We're also going to discuss internal query resolution processes and review some quality assurance findings. And now, Leslie, I meant to mention, I usually turn my camera off. Is that fine with you? Just so that we can get into it. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. Of course.
Okay. Okay. So I'll see you at the end. Okay. So let's get into source documentation. And for some of you, you might be very familiar with this. For others, you might be new to research. The idea of what is the source is it's the first place that clinical research information is either written down on a piece of paper using a pen or typed into a system. And these systems can vary. They can be electronic medical records, they can be electronic source, they can also include patient-reported outcomes entered directly into a system. And the very first time that something is recorded in clinical research, it is called the source. And when we think about source data, this can include information such as clinical findings, observations, and all the activities that are part of the clinical research study. And these source data are located in the source documents. And these source documents are the original documents. They can be records such as the electronic medical record. They can also be paper forms that you create yourself to capture source documentation. And again, they can be electronic systems that are the source document. Now, a CRF, on the other hand, is a sponsor-created document. It can be printed or electronic, and it's designed to capture the recording of source data into a particular system. Now, this system can be a binder system, or it can be called an EDC, electronic data capture, and only the protocol required information can be reported to the sponsor through this EDC, and it needs to be and have prior research ethics board approval on which data points can be submitted to the sponsor. So an example of this might be partial date of birth going into the CRF. At Princess Margaret, we only submit the actual month and the actual year for all of our clinical trials in order to increase patient and participant confidentiality. So please always turn to your protocol as well as your electronic data capture system guidelines any sponsor created guidances or training that they give you in order to learn more about the CRF and the source. So another piece of resource for you will be your institutional standard operating procedure. And these are acronymed as SOPs. So I've taken a snapshot of the one that we use at Princess Margaret, and I think it gives a really nice definition of what we're talking about today. So source documentation is a diverse number of critical records. It's the data and information that are collected during a clinical study. And we need to employ good documentation practices to clearly record what actions took place during the conduct of the study so that there is evidence of what was done. And not only what was done, but of course that the participants existed, that we can substantiate data integrity, confirm these observations back to the source, and tell the story after this is all over. You know, you go about your regular clinical research life and you'll go on to open a new study. However, for many years to come, these studies that we work on today may be audited, monitored, and the data used to further clinical research applications and drug approvals. So this is why we do what we do. Of course, documentation is a vital part of clinical research conduct, and in clinical research, there's a saying that if it wasn't documented, then it wasn't done. So for all the good work that everyone on this call does, and I'm sure you do, please make sure that you're doing good quality documentation according to ICH-GCP, the International Council on Harmonization of Good Clinical Records, especially paying attention to Part 4, which is the investigator responsibilities. So now let's turn to some examples of source documents. So this is, again, the first place that clinical research information is recorded, either written down or entered into a system. So we're very much at Princess Margaret still operating in a hybrid way. So we have some paper records and we have some electronic records. So in terms of paper, we have a physical hospital medical chart. We also have an electronic medical chart, which is called EPR in our case. It could be called EMR in your case. You might be using a particular system, but generally it's the electronic medical record. And then you have documents that are happening on paper, such as clinical research charts, those extra visit logs or paper that you take down vital signs or perhaps an adverse event log during the study. Now, this next point, chemo nursing administration records, speaks to in the cancer disease site space where we're sometimes working with clinical personnel, such as clinical chemo nurse administrators, and they would do clinical documentation that we need to get a hold of because that's going to indicate the administration of the clinical drug. We also have laboratory results, patient diaries, data recorded from ECGs and other automated instruments. We have photographic negatives, x-rays, CTs, PET scans, etc. And we also need to keep in mind of all those departments that we work with across research institutions who might also have source documents. Why do we need to keep this in mind? Well, when we're audited or monitored, we need to pull those records together for a clear, comprehensive story of what happened during the study. So, and then of course, at the end of the study, we need to archive source documents. And as Leslie mentioned, Health Canada has just moved that towards 15 years instead of 25 years. So in clinical research documentation, you're going to become familiar with something called the Alcoa-c principles or the Alcoa-c checklist. And as you can see, this is an acronym that stands for attributable. Is it obvious who made the record or who made a change, a correction? When was it made? So we need initials and a date. And why? So this last piece sometimes becomes forgotten. You can turn to your institutional SOP to think about reasons and maybe indicate those. I like to think about, is this a quick error? Did you write March 31st instead of April 1st, 2022? In that case, you can indicate in error. Or is this correction today being made because of some other piece of important information, such as a monitoring report or the PI, the principal investigator's dictated note? So if you can turn the future person who's reviewing this to the exact reason why you made that change right then and there in the source, this is going to be very helpful. Legible, we need to be able to read it. Contemporaneous, was the information recorded in a way that's consistent with the protocol, but also consistent with a timeline that makes sense? So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're doing pharmacokinetic blood draws where you're drawing blood at 12 noon and then 4 p.m. and then 4 hours later at 8 p.m., etc., you want to see that documentation coming in line items 12 p.m., 4 p.m., and 8 p.m., etc. You don't want the information scrambled in a timeline that doesn't make sense or, all over the place. You want it nicely recorded in the timeline that makes sense. And of course, as the observations were observed. Original, we're always concerned about the original document. We don't recommend photocopying clinical research records unless absolutely necessary. And there aren't too many times when it is absolutely necessary because we do need to safeguard that original record. An example of when it would be appropriate to do a photocopy would be if you had an auditor who would like a photocopy of the most recent REB, Research Ethics Board approval letter, and you provide that to the monitor or the sponsor. We're not photocopying source documents because they're highly identifiable. They contain personal health information, and we don't want those photocopies to walk off site and potentially lead to a breach of confidentiality. So be very careful with photocopies, safeguard the original. Accurate. We want a high level of honesty and accuracy in reporting, and make sure you double check for accuracy. So you glance back at your work, you ask yourself, does this make sense? Did I make any obvious errors? You do that quick double check, and also you're open to be monitored and potentially audited. And then of course, complete. We need to tell the whole story, the complete story, and make sure that every entry that we put into an EDC system, a CRF or a data capture form, is verifiable with a source. So we can't make assumptions in clinical research. We always have to have a source data point to back it up. So let's just review some documentation standards. Make sure that any handwritten notes, printed names, dates are legible. Always sign and self-date all entries, including any credentials that you have, such as RN for clinical trials nurse, perhaps. And we don't advise that you use a date stamp. Instead, use your pen as you're signing, then right beside that, put in the date. We had one investigator, PI, who for some reason refused to date their own signature, and this led to an audit finding. So it's not okay to date even the PI's signature. So date your own signature. Document in a timely manner. So a timely manner can be interpreted many ways. The way that Princess Margaret has interpreted a timely manner is as soon as possible after the care event and within 24 hours. So if you think to yourself, before I leave the building today, I'm going to do my documentation, this is a good way of thinking about it, or within 24 hours. Anything beyond 24 hours would be considered a late entry and needs to be identified as a late entry. Entries should be continuous, no blank pages or lines or spaces. And then this speaks to the contemporaneous nature of documentation, where if you document on Monday, right underneath, you're going to have your Tuesday documentation, and underneath that, you're going to have your Wednesday documentation, just so that it flows and it makes sense. We're not going to destroy any originals. Even if you have a coffee stain on that, or you get a bit of jam from your breakfast, keep the original. We need to keep our participant records secure. And I like to think of a double lock system. So at your site, if you walk into a set of doors, which has a keyed entry, that would be one set of locked, like a research space that is only limited to research professionals. And then the second locking system will be your actual computer itself, always maintaining the confidentiality of your username and your password, and keeping your computer locked when you walk away from it. And then your desk system should have some kind of filing cabinet, which you keep locked at any time. I would also mention that to be careful that you don't invite others to your workspace, because we also have confidentiality with our sponsors, our pharmaceutical companies and other groups that we work with. So anyone visiting your desk could inadvertently see either patient information or sponsor information that needs to be kept confidential as per the contractual agreement that you sign. And by you, I mean really your PI and your study team. And next one, we're not going to be ever dating into the future or into the past. So whatever date you put down in clinical research is going to be today's date, unless you're referring to another visit in the past. That would be fine. But if you're doing documentation today about what you observed, it's always today's date. Records should be maintained chronologically. Be sure to hole punch and file right away. Don't think to yourself, oh, I'm going to do that later. Patient files can go missing or just, blow away out of the chart. So always hole punch and make sure records are secure. And the last point, please use permanent ink. It says blue or black, but blue has a slight preference because black can be interpreted as a photocopy depending on the type of ink you use. And we're not using pencil in clinical research because it can be easily obliterated, erased, smudged, and removed. So we're using permanent ink. Okay, so I usually open this up for a bit of a chat. I don't know, yeah, I guess we can. Anyone in the chat would like to put one word or a couple words, why are we doing this? Why are good documentation practices important? Trust, thank you. Patient trust, trust among your colleagues, communication, yes. What else? Accountability, yes, we need to be accountable to our patients, our participants, our sponsors. Data integrity, safety, thank you. Of course, for auditing purposes, we always want to be audit ready. Scientific integrity, yes, we want to make sure that all the work that we do leads to data that can be provided to our biostatistician team and can be analyzed for some results. Absolutely. Confidence in the data, yes. Thank you. That's really great. Those are all really important pieces. And to recreate the study visit properly, yes. Because you might think to yourself, oh, I'm never going to forget today, but we can only really rely on our memories for about 24 hours, and then things become a bit fuzzy and unreliable. And actually, to that point, I'm going to mention it on another slide, but we have it written in our SOPs that we're only adding documentation to a note within 3 months. So after 3 months, we hit this expiry date and no information can be corrected, changed, or added to. And so, keep that in mind. Why did we pick 3 months? Well, sometimes our investigators are a little bit late in sign off, etc. And we just said, listen, we need to do this within 3 months or else it's not going to be valid. We can't say in good conscience that this is accurate and timely data entry, even in the source. We have another chat. Okay, do you think bringing documents from one office to another during the study visit should be somehow recorded? Let me just see this question. Do you think that bringing documents from one office to another during a study visit, sometimes we have that where we have a locked suitcase where a coordinator is bringing documents in a locked suitcase from one like research space to another. Would that be the situation here? In our case, we don't record it because it is part of the delegation log, that a coordinator would be facilitating monitoring visits and audits, just as long as there's a process in place, such as the system that I recommended, some kind of suitcase with a lock, so that it's not possible that in the middle of the street, the zipper comes open and patient charts start flying in the air. So I would have a system, and in this case, we have an SOP that explains clearly how research charts will be transferred from one space to another. Great question. Next question, is there ever a circumstance where two original documents should be made, such as a consent? My experience has always been one original consent and a copy for the participant. Okay, so I hear that as a two-part question. In terms of a consent, yes, there should only be one original consent, and then the photocopy can be given to the participant. That is a bit of an exception to my rule about no photocopying, so good catch on that. That photocopy would leave our building, leave our possession, and be evidence for the patient participant what they signed consent to. So yes, that's absolutely good practice. Is there any circumstance where two original documents should be made? So in this case, I would say we should only have one original at the site level. And if you have two originals that are documenting the same process, we can get into a situation that we refer to as double documentation, where you have a potential incongruity or discordance between the two records. So an example that we see at Princess Margaret is a clinical research frontline coordinator does documentation on a mild headache. And when the patient sees the physician, there is documentation in the dictated note about a moderate headache requiring medication. So this becomes two original source documents about one data point, which is the adverse event headache. And the discrepancy there needs to be resolved ahead of any monitoring or auditing visit, and also ahead of entry into the electronic data capture system. So you would need, a team meeting, or the frontline coordinator would need to discuss that particular point with the investigator to see who has a more accurate understanding of the situation. In the example I just gave, if medication was provided, then that would be an indication that we'd be thinking about a moderate pain headache, in which case we would keep the investigator's dictated note, and the frontline coordinator would amend his or her documentation to be equally as reflective. So I hope that addressed it. We have a few offices for a study, so I assume it's regulated. We have WP, okay? I think that's a comment. And our next one, we had a project that involved research nurse home visits to consent a patient. RN didn't have access to a printer at home setting. Okay, we asked the research nurses visit to a patient's home with two identical ICFs and sign two ICFs and document the process. Okay, so that's a good question. In my experience, the research team, yeah, that is a bit of a gray area and a bit of a tricky situation, because ideally you want the participant to only sign one consent instead of signing two copies. I know that we have had situations where there is access to a photocopier, and there would be access to making a copy of the original. But what I would advise for that is, if you do write down this process and it is approved by your quality assurance group, and you write it into a standard operating procedure that is institutional, that would be your best defense if you were ever questioned at the level of an audit. Okay.
I know in the past, hi, it's Leslie, that we have taken two versions of the consent. They only sign one, but we leave the blank one with them. And then when there is access to a a photocopier or a scanner, then we send that to the patients. But again, you need to have that process approved.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. Okay, great questions. So I think you've all had time to read this slide. So just a few tips that we've talked about: use blue ink with slight preference to blue. Blue or black are equally okay with a slight preference towards blue. Please avoid other colors such as red, green, purple. Save those for your notes, perhaps, but in clinical research, use blue ink. Always think about good data in will produce good data out. So if you do have questions about the data that you're documenting, address those questions right away. If you need to follow up with another team member, such as the clinician, or if something seems off, make a note to address it right away if you can. Again, if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done, we need proof. And we're following GCP in a way that we have documentation that allows accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. Now, this last point just speaks to being an accepting member of a clinical research space means that you will be audited, monitored, questioned. Sometimes it makes people uncomfortable, to be audited and monitored. There will be mistakes that you make, transcription errors. You'll look at your writing and you'll think, oh yeah, why did I do that? It's perfectly normal, and transcription errors do happen. We just be very open to receiving feedback, learn from your previous mistakes, learn from, talks like this or when others share some of their audit findings, just so that you can be more mindful of what's happening at other sites. And this discomfort that you'll feel when you're being reviewed, questioned, monitored, and audited is very normal, and it will go away after about 6 months. I'd say 6 months to a year, you get kind of used to it, so to speak. So good documentation practice involves these 3 elements: data accuracy, data integrity, and record keeping and timelines. So I mentioned for data accuracy, just to cross-check your information for any errors. Of course, none of us intentionally set out to be misleading, but if we do note that there's, say, a concomitant medication that a patient's taking, they're taking Tylenol with codeine, then the monitor or auditor is going to want to know what that associated medical condition is. It might be pain, but we can't make assumptions in clinical research. We need to see that frontline coordinator who's speaking and meeting with the patient participant to document pain and the associated use of this concomitant medication. So cross-check for things like that, medications and adverse events, or data discrepancies. If you see that it's noted that the patient's year of birth is 1847, that's going to trigger you to think, wait a second, that's not right. Like, no, maybe they were born in 1947, but of course you have to go look for that. So just cross-check for any obvious errors. Okay. So I've mentioned some of these points. At the bottom, always turn to your protocol and your sponsor guidelines. So these can come in the form of CRF completion guidelines, any training that the sponsor provides you at the study initiation visit, because these sponsors, pharmaceutical companies, cooperative groups, will tell you the timelines that they expect you to hand in their case report forms. Please keep in mind that it will be to your site's advantage to adhere to these timelines, and it will reflect well on you as a coordinator and whatever your role is to adhere to these timelines. If you feel like you can't manage the timelines at any time, you can turn to an escalation SOP, bring this forward to your manager, and they might be able to reach out and provide you more time so that you stay on top of your studies. So I mentioned that anything after 24 hours is considered late. There are many reasons that late entries happen, and most of the time it's because someone was very busy in clinic and they weren't able to get to the full documentation. So if this happens and you notice that it is 24 hours after the event, title the information as late entry and add the late entry with the date of the event, which might have been yesterday or the day before, and the date of today, the date that you are doing the documentation. It's important to include why this was missed, or perhaps you just remembered when you were on your way home, you're taking a walk, you looked up at the sky and you thought, oh, wait a second, I forgot to say that the patient has had back pain for a long time, maybe for 10 years. So, you go back to the documentation and you explain why this is missed. And like I said before, anything after 3 months will be considered, a locked record. So we don't advise that you go back and add new information or make corrections beyond 3 months. The reason for that, again, is because any auditor will say, how would you know? How do you remember? How can you, be so confident at your memory that this is exactly what happened? So document in a timely manner. It will be your best defense in an audit situation. And this also goes for the investigators. So some investigators will be late on their dictated notes. Stay on top of them. Physicians should do their dictated notes really within a week of seeing the patient participant. And if it's longer than a month, you'll really need to think about escalating this, because in Canada, we need to prove medical oversight, and dictated physician notes are the best way to show medical oversight. They comment on the health of the patient, the treatment, the plan of care, the consent, eligibility, all of it. So really important to have those dictated notes in a timely manner. Okay, so a few other items to note. Please do not use whiteout in clinical research or ever obscure the original entry. So that includes placing stickers on top. I was once part of an audit where I couldn't believe it. Someone had taken like labels and they had put it over top of their original documentation and just wrote something else. You cannot do that in clinical research. It is part of ICH-GCP that we do not obscure the original entry. So keep it visible, put a single line through and write the new entry with your initials and date. Always initial and date your corrections. We're also not going to disguise an addition, which means, if you went to write a 2 and then realized, oh wait, that should have been a 3, and then you just kind of continue the 2 around to make it a 3, that's also not acceptable in clinical research. You have to just put a line through, write the right entry, initial and date. Also, to that note, make sure that your initials, a sample of your initials, are located in what's called the delegation log or the participant list or the responsibility log, however you call it. And make sure that you don't change your initials, that you're pretty consistent on, these are my initials and this is what I always do, so that an auditor can easily identify that that was you making that entry and that correction. All right, explain corrections. I mentioned this, I can't stress this enough. I've been in audit situations where we had a response evaluation checklist or worksheet where tumors were being measured. So it's a cancer study, a tumor is tumor shrinkage was an endpoint to the study. And a coordinator had changed the measurement number from a 1 to a 2. So instead of 1 centimeter large, it was 2 centimeters large. This had an impact on the overall tumor burden, which then had an impact on whether or not we categorized this as a responding patient to cancer treatment or not. And of course, this was, going to Health Canada, and the data was going to be used for market approval. So very critical data. This is the data that you want clear corrections within and is part of your risk-based monitoring plan, your response evaluation criteria. And it took us about 7 hours of looking for the reason of this 8-year-old study where the coordinator is long gone and we have no idea why the change in the measurement was made. And the auditors will tell you, don't worry, we will wait. And they will wait in the room for your explanation. And so please do us all a favor and explain your corrections, even if you think, oh, it's obvious I made it because of this, and tie a reference, like include the image number, include the dictated note by the physician, include whatever you need to pull the the auditor or the monitor's attention to why you did this. Leslie will also thank you when she's doing any monitoring. Okay. The person who wrote the original entry must correct their own charts. So you can't help a friend out by correcting their own documentation. You need to have the original person correct their own work. Okay. How are we doing on time here? Okay. So just a reminder, CRFs are a printed optical or electronic document that is designed to record protocol information. So here are some examples of paper CRFs and an electronic EDC system, also called eCRF. So this is a bit blurry to protect sponsor confidentiality. Just a few notes: if you're still working with paper CRFs, they come in a little booklet where you have a white page and then 2 carbon copies beneath it. Make sure you're putting enough pressure to have adequate transfer onto the carbon copies. There's an assumption here in a paper CRF that you fill out every single line that's denoted here, and you use any data conventions that they give you, and that you follow any instruction that are provided on the form itself. We can't create new categories, so even if you wanted to, that's not acceptable. This CRF must match the protocol, and also the data that you put on the CRF must match what you told the Research Ethics Board that you would transfer to the sponsor. Only fill out the forms with data that can be verified to a specific data point in the source. So we can't make assumptions. Like I said, we can't say, oh, they're taking Gravol. Well, that must be because of nausea. No, we need to see it in the record that the indication for the Gravol is nausea. And we need to see it there before we put any information into either the paper CRF or the eCRF online. Another piece is that we don't write in the white space of the CRF unless we're making a correction. Otherwise, it's maintained as clean white space. And for paper CRFs, there's headers and footers. Make sure that you're always filling those out and that you don't think to yourself, oh, I'm going to do that later, because if you say you'll do it later, you might forget. So you have to enter all the fields in the header and the footer for every single page. Now, moving on to the eCRF system, one thing to note is that you need to have a username and a password that's unique to you. Never share your usernames and passwords with anybody. It'll be against your privacy and confidentiality rules, your institutional SOP, etc. And it's bad practice in clinical research. Even if you think it's like an emergency, always escalate with the sponsor to get provisional access if that becomes urgently necessary. But do your training well in advance of needing access to the system. Always think of your backup coordinator. So if you have a vacation to go on, or you might become ill, think of who your backup coordinator will be, who has access to the EDC system in the event that there is an urgent situation and you're away. And the other thing I wanted to mention with these EDC systems is sometimes they have these lead-in questions. So what do I mean by a lead-in question? It goes like this: did the patient participant have labs this cycle of treatment? And you have to say yes or no. And until you say yes or no, the form itself for the labs will not appear. So another one is, did the patient participant have adverse events or untoward medical occurrences this cycle? You have to say yes or no. So I find that, some people go into the system and they say, oh, I can't find the page that I'm supposed to use for this. And it's just because they missed one of those leading questions that then triggers the logic to open those certain matrices and other pages. And for clinical data management, I just like to point out that there are many different steps along the way and many different groups that are going to be accessing and working with you for the clinical trial data, starting at the clinical trial data design, which will be a sponsor responsibility to write the protocol and choose all those data elements that will be collected for the study. And then the sponsor will choose sites and do site selection visits. These site selection visits will make sure that the site is adequately trained, has the proper resources and all the proper systems in place. Those sites will then get REB approval. And once they have, in my case, what's called institutional authorization, they will then be open to enrolling or recruiting patient participants. And at that stage, all the staff on the delegation log who are going to do and complete data entry will need access to the data collection tool and will need to get trained. So training encompasses the SIV, which is the site initiation visit. There's also sponsor training that's provided, such as data management guidelines and reading the protocol. I can't stress that enough, just to make sure that you're very familiar with all aspects of the protocol and data collection. And once you consent a patient to a clinical trial, then you will start collecting information that is trial specific on that patient or clinical research specific. You'll start entering the information. This information is going to be monitored by a few people who I'll mention, the monitor of the study, or perhaps your quality assurance team, as well as the system itself and the data manager at the sponsor side. So this is going to result in questions back to the site, and there's going to be a bit of a circular situation here where data is entered, data is reviewed, queries are issued, and data is cleaned. And all we mean by cleaning data is going back to that question, resolving that question or query, and hopefully it won't get reopened for you. Eventually, there's going to be a data analysis whereby the sponsor will tell you, we're going to lock the database. And if you have a database lock, you'll be given a date whereby no data can be entered, no further data can be entered. And these data locks can happen for safety reasons. They can happen for an interim data analysis halfway through the study, or they can also happen at the very end of the study. So pay attention to those data locks. Speak and escalate to your manager if you feel overwhelmed or if you have a lot of data to work on, and make sure that it's all in by those dates. And then at the very end of the study, the data will be reported and perhaps presentations will occur, journals, publications, going to conferences, etc. But along the way, there's going to be many individuals, groups, teams, hands, and eyes on the data. So you won't be alone in working with this data, and just be very comfortable with being asked questions, and always have it in your mind. If I get asked about where did I get this data point from, you always know where you got it from. Here are some examples of some case report forms that you may be involved in entering, such as eligibility and screening and the baseline visit prior to around and prior to consent. Then you have on treatment visits such as physical exams, medical history, prior therapy. When the adverse events come in, perhaps you'll have concomitant medications to enter, laboratory evaluations, and follow-up. These are very cancer-specific CRFs, and I'm mindful that some of you might not be working in cancer and might have slightly different CRFs, but those are some examples. Now, for entering into CRFs, whether it is a paper CRF or an electronic system, like I said, all fields with the expectation that they will be completed as long as the data can be verified with a source, an original record. Entries should follow Alcoa-c, errors should be attributable and explained, and each page on the CRF should have consistent titling, versioning, including the participant ID or the subject ID. Get to know what your sponsor expects of you in terms of when it's acceptable to say, this information was not available, NA, this information was not done, or I just don't know this information because the patient participant did not tell me. So a few things to consider here. If a procedure or a test was not done, this should also trigger you to document in a protocol deviation log that the information, like the test, wasn't performed. you don't have the information because the test wasn't performed. And then when you do have a protocol deviation log where you're capturing these deviations or missed tests, these protocol deviation logs need to be reviewed and signed by the PI at a minimum on a monthly basis. If it's a more urgent protocol deviation, I would have it reviewed in a timely manner, like within 24, 48 hours. Not available, your sponsor may allow this if the information is not available, but oftentimes the sponsor will come back and say, well, when is it available? Like in a week? Sometimes our pathology reports take a little bit of time. So instead of indicating not available, we might just wait a week in order to wait for that data and then enter the data. Unknown or UNK could be used if the sponsor allows and when the date wasn't provided. So an example of this might be the back pain that started 10 years ago. The sponsor would like to know at least a month and a year, but is accepting if the patient doesn't remember what date the back pain started. So for the month, the frontline coordinator might have to work very closely with the patient participant to say, like, was it around a holiday? Was it in the summer or the winter? Do you remember any details? But we are seeing that pharmaceutical sponsors, especially for on-treatment adverse events, really would like to see a full date, a day, a month, and a year for the start and stop of any untoward medical occurrences. And just a couple notes here, please use the data conventions that the sponsor provides you. There's kind of an American way of doing things and a bit of a Canadian way. We really recommend that you use month as a 3-character item instead of a digit, because as you know, days and months can get a bit confusing if you have 2 digits here and then 2 digits there. So preference is to put the month as a 3-character, like July would be JUL. And then for labs, a note about labs, if you're collecting laboratory abnormalities or labs during the study for safety purposes, always mention the name of the lab that you're using and include their lab reference ranges. So what do I mean by reference range? I just mean what is the lower limit of normal for that analyte and what is the upper limit of normal for that analyte. So you'll be able to ask the lab for their individual reference ranges, and then you'll likely need to enter this into the EDC system for future use of that lab name. And keep in mind that some specimens are sent for central review, so you'll be using a central lab, whereas other labs might be just processed by your institutional laboratory, and those will both have a separate set of institutional reference ranges or lab reference ranges. Okay. So some queries directly from the system will include automatic queries and also manual queries. I spoke a bit about those manual queries that might come up, but the automatic queries can be generated by the system itself when you enter data that's non-conformant or has an edit check within the system to bounce back at you and say, this data doesn't make sense. So if you do get automatic queries, I would encourage you all to address those right away, because those might just be a typo that you entered. You see the data, you're able to just go back in and enter the data and make a bit of a correction right away. And then for the manual queries, make sure that you are addressing the question that's come forward and that you're also making sure that you have a verifiable source within the source documents. If you don't, you might have to reach out to your clinical or your frontline team and wait for that answer to come back before you go into the system and resolve the query. So a few considerations: is the study going to be using paper or eCRFs? And get to know that at the beginning of the study. Who needs to be delegated to sign off on the CRF? Usually that's the PI, but make sure that the PI has their own training and credentials and usernames and passwords all sorted out so that this PI will be ready to sign off on CRFs. And this is a GCP requirement to sign off on CRFs. And who needs access to the CRF? We're noticing that some serious adverse events, and serious as defined by Health Canada's definition of serious adverse events. So some serious adverse events might be entered directly into the ECRF by the frontline coordinator. So if that's the case, your frontline coordinator may require access to the ECRF as well as the data management team. And then at the end of the study, make sure that you receive a copy of the CRFs from the sponsor so that you're able to do archiving according to GCP and keep those in Canada for at least 15 years. Now, sometimes at the beginning of the study, you're able to get access to the CRFs just to see what the sponsor is going to be asking you for. So we've seen that some studies are a bit more complicated and have information that wouldn't typically be collected as part of regular study visit in this therapeutic area or disease site. And so for those, we sometimes are able to create what's called a source document template in order to create a very specified detail and level of information. So an example of this might be a lung cancer study where the sponsor really wants to know a detailed addiction history, smoking, or addictive substances use. And the level of detail is kind of beyond what you would have in a normal conversation with a patient participant. So in order to capture this level of detail, then source document templates are created. Just a few points here. If you do develop a source document template, you get it reviewed by someone internally, like a QA or a more senior staff in your department. You have a version date on your source document template, and you make sure that it's identifiable to the patient participant that you're working with. And if you'd like, we have a whole course on this, creating source documentation tools that you're welcome to attend that spends quite a bit of time talking about source document tools. And then the bottom point here, if you notice something on the case report form that's not required by the protocol, always clarify with the sponsor. If it's not in the protocol or consent, we should not be capturing this data or sending it to the sponsor. So it's definitely acceptable to ask clarifying questions and have a critical eye and a critical opinion prior to sending information forward. So an example of this, I was working on a study and I was working with a US sponsor, and they had a very detailed demographic and ethnicity section. And I knew from our research ethics board letter of approval that we are not providing data at that level for demographics and ethnicity. And that was not approved to send forward to the US sponsor. So I got in touch with the sponsor, and it turns out that it was a mistake and that we were actually sent a copy of the American CRFs instead of the Canadian site CRFs. And that action was corrected, and we didn't have any privacy or confidentiality breaches. So it's okay to ask questions and just be mindful that we can only send data that is approved by our REB. Okay, so in the interest of time, because I think we do have quite a small amount of time left, I just would like to skip past where to find source documents, because this is, will be your particular system, and just jump to sending questions and queries to the coordinator. So again, all information has to be entered in the source prior to entering it into the data capture system. And the same process applies to resolving queries. We're not going to be extrapolating any information. And if the information cannot be located in the source document, we recommend that you issue an internal query to the frontline coordinator if it's not completed by the same individual to sort this out. So here's our internal query resolution form. And instead of writing emails back and forth, we developed this form back in 2016 in order to clarify some of the questions that were coming in and indicate if there was a data lock deadline, if there was any urgency to this, indicate the visit name and the visit type, and put one clear question per line item. And here's an important point too, that we're not trying to add new information to this form, but instead we always want to go back to the original source to make the data correction or entry, or addition as a late entry, or provide additional clarification as to where this source can be located. So this record also serves as a way for a monitor or an auditor to really tell the story about why corrections were made, and this can be referenced too. So any point of confusion, or even just clarifying if a procedure or a test was missed, this can be a very helpful tool. Okay, so Leslie, I think I am at time. So I do have I think I got through most of my stuff, but really just a last point, thinking critically about the data. Of course, I'm happy to share these slides if you're interested. I do have some quality assurance review findings that you can kind of take a glance at. We had significant findings and procedural findings, and this is a snapshot of our most frequently audited and cited standard operating procedures, which are listed down here in this order. So yeah, so I guess, if anyone wants to reach out and has any questions, I'm happy to answer those.